I took about 20 photos of this rotunda in a park in Hobart because, well, it was visually such a great subject, but I basically took photos all around it trying to get the best background because the backgrounds were quite different depending where you stood. And once I saw this one, I thought, this will be the one I draw because I liked the way the rotunda really stood out against the dark trees. It's really silhouetted, I think, very effectively. So that's the effect, that's the visual impact I'm trying to capture in this drawing. A fairly silhouetted depiction of this fairly simple form. So with all the marks I'm making, that's my intention. It's always good to have an intention. We're not just copying a subject, but we're creating an effect that we see in the subject. And we may see it very directly, or we may see partly what we're thinking, but we want to enhance it in our drawing. Now, we're not quite front on with this rotunda, and again, this is where careful observation is important. We're not looking straight on, therefore the left and the right sides that slope away are not the same. The left-hand side slopes away at a far greater angle than the right-hand side. And in fact, on the right-hand side, we can just see part of another side. And so we want to try and capture that as well. I'm really starting off by trying to catch the colonnade. It's tricky to draw in that we've got this space between the columns, but because there's double columns, but the outside columns are actually on the next side, it does affect the way we see and therefore judge proportions. Now, these columns are quite slim, so with two of them together, the line thickness can make a difference to how we perceive what we've drawn, because we tend to see inside the lines, but the lines are still part of our width in terms of our drawing. And when we have two columns together like this in a close space, it can mean we're tempted to put them too wide apart. So now, just trying to get the colonnade done and allow the space for the rails, and just get a sense of, before I put the furthest columns in, am I happy with the proportions? Because the more I draw in at this stage, the less easy it will be to make any adjustments. I'm using a 0.3mm black Copic multi-liner pen, and I'm going to use the same pen for the whole drawing. Now trying to add some of the other columns because I'm happy with what I've drawn so far. I think it's as good as I'm going to get. Now working out the roof, how far down it comes. We can also look at what we're doing by judging the negative space and the shapes that we create between the roof and the bottom of the rail. But we need to bear in mind that the rail on the other side shows slightly above the rail on our top side. So if we're thinking of using negative space, we want to make sure that we've got that rail line in, because it does discernibly change the proportions. There it is, I just put it in then. And now add this. I'm not being overly fussed with the tops of these columns and the base, or the pad that sits on top. Now I messed this up slightly in that I mark where I want the top of the dome to go, put a line there, and then I realize that I haven't put the final layer, and now I just realize what I need to do. It's lucky I was actually marking the photo just to kind of show you that that's where I was looking, because it made me realize. But now the top of the dome is a little bit too low. If I could draw this again, I would probably just leave it where it is, but I did push it up slightly, although I think the line work for the tiling on the roof does hide that mark a bit. But I've decided to put off the scary curve drawing section for a bit longer. But here we go. notice it's important again to observe where the dome comes down. It does not come down to the side, close to the edge. It actually stops some distance from the side. And not just that, but it goes closer to the right-hand side than the left-hand side. And again, that's because we're not looking straight on, and therefore the angled sections don't symmetrically line up on each side. But fortunately, with those horizontal lines, which probably weren't quite as horizontal as they could have been, but they are the sort of lines that for me it's best to do fairly briskly to get a nice light and clean look. So now I start to work on the leaves, the foliage. It's really important to get a nice dark effect if I'm trying to create a silhouette effect. Although I also need to put some hatching for the underside of the roof, of the rotunda roof. So I actually speed up the hatching for the foliage quite a bit compared to the rotunda. It's not really what this video is about, and there is quite a lot of it. And I think it's an example of this sort of drawing where sometimes we started drawing because of a certain effect or a certain part of the subject that we really engage with. And yet to complete the scene, there's a lot of line work to be done that really doesn't interest us much at all. Now, I do enjoy drawing trees and foliage. Fortunately, I do have a fairly ready and a fairly brisk technique with which to do it, but it still sometimes just takes a long time. And when it's not what the drawing's about, it can be difficult to keep our concentration up and to do it all to the same level of line work and intent. It can be, I guess to put it bluntly, easy to get careless with it as the drawing progresses. And that's partly why I jump back and forth from it. I do a bit more of the rotunda, I do a bit more of the foliage, I do a bit more of the rotunda. I find it easier to commit to a greater detail, a greater working for effect with the foliage marks if I do it that way. Even so, they are pretty brisk marks because it really is the rotunda that we want to stand out. Now we also want a nice crisp edge where the hatching comes up against any part of the rotunda. We don't want careless lines that protrude into the columns or into the dome, anywhere else. And yet we do want our marks to come right up to the rotunda. So it is important to just have a little bit of care there and just at times checking around the border of the rotunda, at the silhouette edge of the rotunda, above the columns, between the columns and below the columns, to make sure we get the darkness up against the lightness that we want. You'll notice with the base, I don't draw straight lines because I don't feel like straight lines are going to represent the effect of the stonework well. When we draw, we're not drawing shapes, we're not putting a heavy outline around the outside edges, we're creating the form that we see, and the form that we see here is a very textured surface one. Now equally, I don't want to overdo the effect of the stonework, because if we look at the rotunda overall, we can see the stonework there, but it doesn't visually come out particularly strongly, mostly because it's all very light and there aren't shadows and it's a similar colour to the columns. The light and dark value interplay really takes attention away from the stonework. And yet, I still want to have it look like it's stonework. Now, you'll notice for that veranda that I've just done, and the one I've also now just done, the railing, that's the sort of detail that I think is really worth experimenting with on a scrap of paper, just to work out the way you're going to do it. The way I've done it isn't the first way I was going to do it. I tested the first way and I thought, no, for this size, this is not going to turn out. So I chose a different way of establishing the forms. But for that left-hand rail design work, it really is just hinting at, just suggesting the sort of detail. We're not trying to actually draw whatever detail we can see. And for the rail sloping to the right, it's important to notice that it's going to be slightly foreshortened because it's moving away from us. But there'll be something obviously recognizable of the pattern there. So now I'm trying to just do some line work to suggest the stonework without it becoming too dark, too heavy, too overwhelming, too prominent. Which means I do have to hold this pen very lightly, because if I don't, the mark will be too heavy. And so that at times makes it tricky to control the line quite as much as I want for the stones, because I'm holding it light and I'm moving it quickly to get a lighter effect. Though the good news is if the line goes in the wrong place, well, at least it's a light line. And now I just add this boy on the skateboard. I mean, generally I'm keen to avoid figures if I can, but figures are often important for a sense of scale, and I think that without this figure, it's easy to think that the rotunda is actually smaller than it is. It is quite a large structure, and it's the figure that tells us that. And so just a little bit of context in the front. But I'm not going to do many marks in the front. I'm not going to really worry about grass, because it's that central band through the middle of the colonnade with the lights and darks and the columns and then the dome on the top. These are all the things that I want the attention to be drawn to. So now I'm just working out some marks that will just hint at the decorative woodwork for the rail. And if you're still watching at this point, why not hit the like button? Share the video with a friend. And if you haven't subscribed already, why not? And of course, you'll find this reference photo on my channel community page, so why not? Go to that, have a look, and have a go drawing this. But can I suggest that you don't look at my drawing while you do your drawing? And so we're just about done. This took me 35 minutes to do in real time, so it was a fairly brisk drawing, and probably half of that was spent doing the trees. At least it felt like that. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. I hope you found this interesting. I hope you give it a go. It's a nice little subject. There are some things about it that are really quite straightforward. There are some things about it, though, that will be challenging. So, all in all, it's a great drawing exercise if you've got half an hour to an hour to do some drawing. But look, whatever you draw, however you draw it, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.